Okay, welcome to week 11 of the ISM 4003 Contemporary Documentary Media. The topic of this week is Sense and Sensibility, Rethinking Documentary Agency and Aesthetics in the Age of the Anthropocene. This is part one of two parts. Now for this week, I asked that we watch Mel Banks' 2007 In My Language, and then Lucian Casting Taylor and Verena Paravel's 2012 Leviathan. I asked that we read Lucian Casting Taylor's Iconophobia, published in 1996, as well as Hito Sterl's essay The Language of Things, published in 2006. I also recommended Scott McDonald's essay or chapter from Sensory Ethnography from his book Avant-Doc, Intersections of Documentary and Avant-Garde Cinema, which further discusses Leviathan. So as I said, I've structured this lecture into two parts. The first, I will briefly take up the concept of the Anthropocene before moving on to a discussion of In My Language. And then in the second part, we turn to Leviathan and the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab, or SEL. And then finally, we will have our discussion topics. So, very quickly, the Anthropocene. I would like to just draw our attention to two quotations for us to consider this concept and its relevance to thinking the documentary or the contemporary documentary. The first is a paraphrase of the geologist and scientist Paul Crutzen, cited by Will Steffen and amongst others in their essay, The Anthropocene, Conceptual and Historical Perspectives, in which they write, quote, "The activity of the human species now rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the Earth system, such that humankind has become a geological force in its own right." And furthermore, according to Tom Cohen and Claire Colebrook, as they put it in their book Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols, quote, "The formation of a we is generated from destruction and from the recognition of destruction. Humanity as global anthropos comes into being with the Anthropocene, with the declaration that there is a unity to the species and that this unity lies in its power to mark the planet." Now, of course, Cohen and Clarebrook go on to state that while there is this sense of the unity of the anthropos in the periodization of the Anthropocene, marking the human being as the single most effective force of climate change in the world, hence Anthropocene, the age, as it were, of mankind, or humankind, we could say, there is nevertheless a host of distinctions that we must make between the various modalities of being human. Of course, people across the globe there are many differences of geography, of race, ethnicity, sex, gender, language, culture, as well as differences of ability, disability, cognitive identities, or attributes attributed to people who are, quote unquote, neurodivergent, for example. And so when we think about the concept of the Anthropocene and the global effect of humans on the environment, in particular creating massive climate change as we know it, it does raise a number of questions for how we are to represent the subject of documentary and the different kinds of subjects of documentary, and then the ways that we might start thinking about the aesthetic forms of the documentary and how it can depict and reflect and engage with, or presence, which is a key term that we'll be using this week, how it can engage with these different aspects of the human and the different types of human subjects that populate the Earth. And this thus takes us to 2007's video In My Language. Now, we have to first note that In My Language is made by Mel Banks, who has been described as a low-functioning autistic person. Mel Banks identifies as a they/them, or that is to say non-binary, and In My Language is a video posted onto YouTube in 2007, and it is a kind of combination of the first-person film, the documentary, and what we might think as video art, as well as activist and political film. Um, in our discussion of In My Language, we want to begin to consider how translation, the politics of translation, we note that the film is sort of divided into two parts. The first part, as it were, in Mel Beg's, as they put it, native language. And then, of course, the second half of the video is entitled My Translation, which puts this native language, contextualizes it in terms of the English language and the language for more traditional documentary viewers, we might say. And so this question of translation raises issues of belonging, and such as questions of belonging to national cultures, national traditions and languages, but it also raises perhaps the more fundamental questions, ontological questions, epistemological questions of how humans relate to the world of objects as well as the natural world, the world of human objects and the world of natural objects. And so we start to think about how language then is not simply a cultural expression, but is in fact integral in some shape or form to being human and in the way that the human relates to the world. And thus we have to start thinking about the question of form. So we start to think about form in the documentary, and this raises what we might call thinking of the politics of representation and what we will refer to as presencing in documentary and film and media. And so we will consider relationships between agency and aesthetics, that is to say, form and style, as well as connections between the personal, the social, and the political, and how questions of method, the methods of making a documentary film or a documentary video, and the political objectives therein. And thus we see in the three screen grabs that I provided from In My Language, we have the subtitle, as in a sense, stating, this is Mel Begg stating that only when the many shapes of personhood are recognized will justice and human rights, in fact, be possible. Now, very quickly, I would just like to turn to a quote from Michael Renov, which I have returned to in a number of times throughout this course, but I think again it is pertinent to thinking about the politics and the aesthetics of In My Language. And just again to quote Renov, the time has certainly arrived for a reassessment, for the open acknowledgement that the subject in documentary has to a surprising degree become the subject of documentary. And so how is Mel Beggs the subject of In My Language? And of course, we had the four theses from Renov, in which he said that number one, private truths, inner realities have come to be the business of documentary as much as public proclamations. The very idea of autobiography reinvents the very idea of documentary. Second, filmic autobiography is nothing new. Third, filmic autobiography comes in many forms. And finally, the autobiographical embraces and is inflected by the political. And so we can start to question and think about how Mel Beggs' video, in some sense, is a biographical or autobiographical documentary, but how does it become also a kind of political statement? So I would just like to turn to the question of the essay film, which we discussed last week in our chat, and draw our attention to a quote from the German-speaking modernist novelist and essayist Robert Musil, who in his book, his modernist book from the 1930s, The Man Without Qualities, wrote of the essay, quote, "An essay is the unique and unalterable form assumed by a man's inner life in a decisive thought. Nothing is more foreign to it than the irresponsible and half-baked quality of thought known as subjectivism." And what I would just simply like to note here is that when we think about the essay film, we want to not only consider it in terms of subjectivity or some notion of interior mental processes, but in fact, how these mental interior processes are not only subjective, but how they relate to the world, how they make claims upon the world, how they relate to a system of objects. And so it will not suffice, at least according to Robert Musil, to simply resort to saying that the essay film and then perhaps the documentary more generally simply represents subjectivity. And then this then will perhaps be further articulated through the French filmmaker and artist and curator Jean-Pierre Gorin, who in the early 2000s curated an exhibition of essay films, and in the exhibition text accompanying it that he entitled Proposal for a Tussle, wrote, "What if we had essay films less for the fact that a nominative singular pronoun spoke in them, and less for the fact that a type of persona could emerge as a watermark of that discourse, than for the fact that in certain films an energy engaged and redefined incessantly the practice of framing, editing, and mixing, disconnecting them from regulatory assumptions of the genre." So what we start to have here is how the essay film is, again, not simply the expression of, as it were, an I or a subjectivity, but we need to think of the politics of its form, how the form of the essay film, things like editing, mixing, framing, and so forth, can articulate different ways of being in the world and making claims about the world that may not be of the traditional expository or dominant values of documentary film and more broadly Western ideology. And so the essay film in this way may bear a number of sets of relations to things like third cinema, as well as the Soviet cinema of the 1920s. So there is a question of collectivity also in the essay film, and we can think about, in a sense, perhaps counterintuitively, the questions of collectivity as they pertain to a work like In My Language. So in this way, I would like to draw our attention to a quote from Peter Sterl from the essay that I asked you to read, The Language of Things, in which Sterl writes, quote, "We see in experimental documentary production that different relations to things and the social conditions in which we relate to them are possible. The reason is very simple. The rise of importance of global documentary jargons rests on the material base of information capitalism, which is defined by digitalization and flexibility. And any documentary form which really articulates the language of those things also articulates precisely these conditions, that is, the conditions of precarious symbolic production." And so what I would like to draw our attention to here is if we think about In My Language as a kind of experimental documentary or perhaps as an essay film, we can see how it is perhaps itself reflecting on what Sterl calls the conditions of precarious symbolic production in a global capitalist world, and then perhaps also in the age of the Anthropocene. So In My Language is reflecting on how the conditions under which a person is recognized as articulating meaning, and perhaps even more politically, is recognized as a person as such. So let us consider what Sterl calls the language of things and how it is worked out in My Language. And I've included here 4 screen grabs from the video, from the second half of the video, in which Mel Baggs draws our attention to some of the ways that they engage with the things or objects of the world. So as Mel Baggs says, I smell things, I listen to things, I feel things, I taste things, I look at things. I look at things. It is not enough to look and listen and taste and smell and feel. I have to do those to the right things, such as look at books, and fail to do them to the wrong things, or else people doubt that I am a thinking being. Now, one thing I would like to draw our attention to in terms of the aesthetics of In My Language is something that Laura Marks, the theorist Laura Marks, in her 1998 essay Video Haptics and Erotics, calls haptic perception. This is Marks. How does video, specifically video, achieve a haptic character? It is commonly argued that film is a tactile medium and video an optical one, since film can be actually worked with the hands. Now that more films are edited and post-produced with video or computer technologies, this distinction is losing its significance. An exception is experimental filmmaking techniques such as optical printing and scratching the emulsion, and here we could think of filmmakers like Stan Brakhage. Now Marx goes on. Many prohaptic properties are common to video and film, such as changes in focal length, graininess, produced differently in each medium, and effects of under and overexposure. And so what I would really just like to draw our attention to here in this notion of the haptic is how we can think about haptic visuality or haptic perception in a sense as a way of suggesting touching the world with the eye. That is to say, the EYE, the eye. How, in a way, is the world touched, and is the self, on the other hand, is the self touched by the world, and how does the self touch the world? And I've included here two particular images. One from Agnes Varda's essay film, The Gleaner's and I, which we watched last week, which is, of course, a close-up of the filmmaker's hand, as it were, engaging with the world, sort of really drawing our attention to the hapticity of the video image. And then, of course, on the right here, Mel Beggs' hand in My Language as they reach out and engage with a knob on a dresser. Now, Marx goes on in Video Haptics and Erotics, quote, "Haptic perception is usually defined as the combination of tactile, kinesthetic, and proprioceptive functions, the way we experience touch both on the surface of and inside our bodies. In haptic visuality, the eyes themselves function like organs of touch. Haptic visuality, a term contrasted to optical visuality, draws from other forms of sense experience, primarily touch and kinesthetics. Because haptic visuality draws upon other senses, the viewer's body is more obviously involved in the process of seeing than is the case with optical visuality." And so how does this play out, this question of haptic perception, of haptic visuality, of touching through seeing, and in seeing being touched, play out in My Language? Well, we can again turn to Heather Sterl's The Language of Things, in which she writes, in this drawing on the work of Walter Benjamin, the German cultural theorist, in this Benjaminian perspective, a thing is never just something, but a fossil in which a constellation of forces is petrified. According to Benjamin, things are never just inert objects, or passive items, or lifeless shucks at the disposal of the documentary gaze, but they consist of tensions, forces, hidden powers, which keep being exchanged. And what we see here in these two images from the video in My Language is one of the ways that this so-called low-functioning autistic person, Mel Beggs, has a mimetic or gestural relationship to the things of the world. In this case, and perhaps very tellingly, an American flag blowing outside in the street, and we have Mel Beggs inside their apartment engaging on the left with a piece of paper and mimicking the blowing of the flag, and then with their own hand on the right. And there's actually quite a sophisticated set of interactions and reciprocities between Beggs and the external world that we are witnessing here. So then this takes us, in order to contextualize it further, what Beggs does in the video, to what I'm calling here the politics and poetics of translation. And so, of course, as I mentioned, the video is divided in two parts. The second part is entitled A Translation, in which Beggs takes it upon himself to put into, traditional language as we understand it, the English language in this case, an articulation, a contextualization of the first half of the video and the complex exchanges therein. The haptic exchanges therein, we might further argue. And so in this statement, Beggs says or writes, Beggs writes, quote, "My language is not about designing words or even visual symbols for people to interpret. It is about being in a constant conversation with every aspect of my environment. Ironically, the way that I move when responding to everything around me is described as being in a world of my own. But precisely what we're seeing throughout this video, in fact, and that is brought to our attention linguistically in the second half of the video, is in fact the complex system of exchange going on between Beggs and the world, this so-called person of low-functioning autism who is said to be in a world of their own. And clearly, we are getting a sense that they, in fact, are not. So Beggs goes on. The first part of the video is in my native language, and then the second part provides a translation, or at least an explanation. This is not a look at the Autie gawking freak show as much as it is a statement about what gets considered thought, intelligence, personhood, language, and communication, and what does not. And again, this relates to the previous quote from Beggs that I provided earlier, in which Beggs describes how we, in a certain normative sense, we not only recognize a person and their their personhood and their being and their value in terms of doing the proper things to certain objects and not doing those things to other objects, right? So one is supposed to have said to, read a book at a certain distance and read the words on the page. And here we see Baggs in this still from the video, Baggs base, into the book. And then what we really have, however, is a different set of relations playing themselves out, and then of course recontextualized through the voiceover and subtitle. So this takes us then further into Sterl's argument in the language of things. Quoting, drawing on Benjamin, Sterl writes, Benjamin relates translation directly to power by looking at the form of the translation, not its content. The respective form of translation will decide if and how the language of things, with its inherent forces and energies and its productive powers, is subjected to the power-knowledge schemes of human forms of government or not. It decides whether human language creates ruling subjects and subordinate objects, or whether it engages with the energies of the material world. And we might argue then that in my language, in a way, is about exposing traditional documentary viewers expecting traditional documentary forms and systems of representation to actually a world of as it were, energies, a world of variations and complexity that are not immediately apparent in traditional documentary aesthetics and their systems of producing meaning. And so then we can further quote Sterl, who says, translating the language of things is about creating unexpected articulations, which do not represent precarious modes of living or the social as such, but rather are about presencing precarious, risky, and at once bold and preposterous articulations of objects and their relations, which still could become models for future types of connection. And so in this sense, in my language, Baggs is in fact, in a way, guiding so-called neurotypical viewers, perhaps, into another modality of presencing the things of the world and recognizing the types of subjectivity that engage with them, but also perhaps then building and bridging new types of connection. And so we have this sort of development of this kind of reflection, this meta-reflection in the second half of the video on the as Baggs puts it, the language that Baggs develops as a so-called low-functioning autistic and how they engage with the world. And so finally, to quote Sterl again, or almost finally, thus things can be interpreted as conglomerates of desires, wishes, intensities, and power relations, and a thing language, which is thus charged with the energy of matter, can also exceed description and become productive. It can move beyond representation and become creative in the sense of a transformation of the relations which define it. So rather than objects simply having the specific labels and the specific uses to which they are put and then being inserted inside of a documentary film and reflected on and represented thereby, we actually have a transformation perhaps inside of the documentary through its aesthetics, through its forms, through the hapticity perhaps of video, and so forth. We can actually begin to think about different sets of ways of relating to objects and understanding things, the relations in which that we are in fact always already bound up with them. So Sterl goes on then to conclude, let me make one thing very clear. To engage in the language of things in the realm of the documentary form is not equivalent to using realist forms in representing them. It is not about representation at all, but about actualizing whatever the things have to say in the present. And so Sterl then concludes, and to do so is not a matter of realism, but rather of what Sterl calls relationalism. It is a matter of presencing, and thus transforming the social, historical, and also material relations which determine things. And if we focus on this aspect of presencing instead of representation, we also leave behind the endless debate about representation, which has left documentary theory stuck in a dead end. And so, really just to say here, what Sterile is drawing our attention to is perhaps inside of the documentary form and its claim to showing us and engaging with the real things of the real world and the material things of the real world. And more specifically, the objects, the events, the energetic forces, and so forth. Perhaps rather than insisting inevitably on the question of representation, we can think about how when the things of the world, the energies of the world, the events of the world, the people of the world, the animals, and so forth, all of the objects of the world, when they are brought into the documentary form in terms of the question of a kind of presencing, as Cheryl puts it, we move beyond representation into a more expansive engagement with systems, questions of relation, okay, and rethinking the terms by which we understand things and our own relationship to them. So that was only touching on a number of the issues that In My Language raises. And I would like then, when we turn to the second part of this lecture and go into Leviathan and the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab, to keep these questions of the, as it were, language of things and the sort of experimentation with how we relate to them that Baggs carries out, I would like for us to take that into our look at Leviathan. So let us turn now to that interesting film about industrial fishing produced by the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab. Thank you.